Grace and peace to you from God our Creator and from Jesus, the Son of God, who is the Incarnation. Amen. One of my very favorite places to take groups camping is Assateague Island National Seashore on the Maryland coast. I've brought mission trip groups there many times. In fact, really, if we're ever even remotely in range, I'll make a point of bringing groups camping there after our work weeks with Habitat for Humanity because the place has such great group campsites. Only 50 yards from the ocean waterline, just over the dunes from the beach, protected from the wind, the sandy ground is soft to sleep on, and the breezes are pleasant. Wild horses, descendants from horses shipwrecked hundreds of years ago, wander up and down the beach and throughout the national park. It is all very picturesque. Now, I want to be honest, when I would bring groups there, we would call it camping light. Or sometimes I'd use the phrase, camping with donuts. You see, we weren't really equipped for hardcore camping. We were, after all, a mission trip group. So we were heavy on hammers and saws and tools, but we carried just barely enough camping equipment to be able to stay a few nights at Assateague. And really, we were only interested in being there for the time together on the beach. So you can imagine the look of horror on the scoutmasters' faces when our group pulled up to camp at the group site next to theirs. Now, their site, I noted when we arrived, was set up with military precision. Tents were all in a row. A large screen tent had been set up just for cooking and eating. They traveled with their own portable flagpole and literally had reveille and taps every day. They even, I kid you not, raked the sand in their campsite daily. We, on the other hand, backed our trailer up to the campsite and in an effort to get to the beach and the water quickly, just unloaded everything. In about 10 minutes, our area looked like an Abercrombie and Finch store had thrown up all over the sand. Our tents were scattered and were barely standing. Beach towels were hanging randomly from branches. We were a scoutmaster's worst nightmare. Well, finally, after just kind of looking over and watching us for a little while, the scoutmasters mustered up the courage to come over and introduce themselves to us. We exchanged names and pleasantries, and I said, kind of apologetically, "We're not Boy Scouts." "Clearly," said the scoutmaster. And then he went on to say, "And I guess we're neighbors. So how long will you be," and then he swallowed hard and said, "with us." With us. When he said those words, he said them with a kind of a sense of dread, as in, how long exactly are we going to have to put up with your group? With us is, I believe, actually one of the most powerful phrases in the English language. When we celebrate baptisms, marriages, anniversaries, Christmas, Thanksgiving, you name it, people we love come to be with us. When we mourn, when we grieve, when we are sick, when we suffer, when we are in need, people come alongside of us to share in that, to support us, and to be with us. In our everyday life, in our offices, in our cubicles next door, in the hallway, at our locker, our friends are with us. And we often make decisions about which events or gatherings we will go to, based at least partially on who will be there with us. Our gospel lesson for today is all about with us. If you look at John 1, verse 14, you'll find these three critical words. If you brought your own Bible, I'd even recommend that you underline these three words, because I believe that they describe the whole idea of the incarnation and really our relationship with God. In that verse it says, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us." Lived among us. To live among us means to dwell with, to come alongside, to be in the presence of, to be with us. And this implies a relationship, friendship, or maybe even family. In the original Greek text for this verse, we learn that this Greek word, which is translated as live among us, can also be translated as pitched a tent with. And so hear this verse this way. And the Word became flesh, and Jesus pitched his tent with us. Pitching a tent implies that one is planning on staying a while. Jesus came to be with us for the duration. He came to be with us in every circumstance of life. The Christmas story is the story of how God came to be with us in all circumstances of life. Jesus made a promise, a commitment when he came to earth to be with us. I've heard this referred to as the Christmas promise. And now, in the midst of the Christmas season, we live in that promise. The problem is that for us, Christmas is a season, and all seasons come to an end. And with the end of the Christmas season, we often forget about the promise of the season, of Jesus' promise to be with us. When Jesus pitches his tent next door, his commitment is to be with us through it all, through the joys and the sorrows. Now, when I teach about this idea in confirmation, the idea of the incarnation, pretty consistently, there's a question that I get asked. A young person will raise their hand, I'll call on them, and they'll ask me, they'll say, Pastor Todd, so how does that work? This whole God becoming human thing. I love that question, and I hate that question, because it's really hard to get your mind wrapped around. It's very difficult to describe. It's almost impossible to explain. It is a part of the mystery of God. And so often, I'll just tell this story. It's a story that Paul Harvey wrote in a parable called The Christmas Storm. He wrote that this is about a modern man, one of us. He was not a Scrooge. He was a kind, decent, mostly good man, generous to his family, upright in his dealings with others. But he did not believe in all that incarnation stuff that the churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just didn't make sense to him, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just could not swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as man. I'm truly sorry to distress you, he told his wife, but I'm not going with you to church this Christmas Eve. He said he would feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather stay home, but that he would wait up for the family for when they returned. So he stayed and they went. Shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall. He went to the window to watch the flurries getting heavier and heavier, and then he went back to his fireside chair and began to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, and then another and another. At first, he thought someone must be throwing snowballs against his living room window. But when he went out the front door, he found a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They had been caught in the storm, and in a desperate search for shelter, they had tried to fly through his large landscaped window. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures just lie there and freeze. He remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide warm shelter if he could direct the birds to it. He quickly put on his coat and boots, trampled through the deepening snow to the barn, opened the door wide, and turned on a light. But the birds did not come in. He thought maybe food would entice them in, and he hurried back to the house and fetched breadcrumbs, sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flap around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them, waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction, except into the warm, lighted barn. And then he realized that they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I'm a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I'm not trying to hurt them, but to help them. How? Any move he made tended to frighten them, confuse them, and they just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. If only I could be a bird and mingle with them and speak their language and tell them not to be afraid and show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I'd have to be one of them so they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells in the distance began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sound of the wind, and he stood there listening to the bells, pealing the glad tidings of Christmas, and he sank to his knees in the snow. What does it mean for Jesus to be with us? When the storms come, and they will, Jesus steps into them with us. When we are deepest in our grief, it is Jesus who is present with us. When our marriage feels like it's in tatters and we're not sure what tomorrow is going to look like, Jesus is right there with us. When we're exhausted from being disappointed again, Jesus promises to be there with us. The incarnation is God in human form. Jesus is God with skin on, walking, talking, teaching, laughing, and living as an example of what we are to be for others. This is the true gift of Christmas. And Jesus does this out of his deep love for us. Jesus does this because he knew that we could not do it for ourselves. Jesus does this for you. For you. Jesus promises to be with you. But there's more. God comes incarnate in human form to teach us to become an incarnation. While Jesus is the incarnation of God, he then calls us to be the incarnation of faith. We become faith with skin on for others to see, to know, and to experience. What does this look like? When, because of our faith, we stand up for what is right, even in the face of pressure to do what is wrong. When, because of our faith, we reach out and we serve those most in need, even when it's hard. When, because of our faith, a group of people gather, as we did a couple of weeks ago, and go Christmas caroling at assisted living centers, care centers, and at Homestead Hospice. I stood in Gordy Fretham's room at the hospice house when about a dozen of us sang, "Angels we have heard on high." And when we got to the chorus, "Gloria in excelsis Deo," Gordy, whose eyes were closed, began singing with us. It was a powerful moment, and Jesus was there, and we got to live that out. Our words, our actions, our service, our laughter, our very lives represent what it is to be people of God. Jesus is God incarnate so that we can become faith incarnate. Those around us, our children, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers can look at us and say, "Oh, so that is what a person of faith looks like." Jesus comes to be with us. First and foremost, because of his great love for us. And secondly, so that we might be with us to those around us. Jesus' tent is pitched. He is here, and he's staying for a while. And regardless of whether your life, your campsite is neat and orderly or feels chaotic and askew, Jesus walks over and extends a hand. Open yourself to the presence of God, to the incarnation, to Jesus, who lives and walks here today with us. Amen.